This is Darren, head of remote at GitLab, the world's largest all-remote company. And today I've got Luke joining me. He has some really interesting questions on the phases of remote adaptation and what the world's going to look like 6 to 12 months from now. So I'm excited to dig in. Luke, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Really excited to have this conversation. A little bit about me. I'm the founder of Friday. I've worked remotely for 6 or 7 years at this point for a few different companies. And we've built software to help you create process and structure to the way that you communicate. So we make it really, really easy to share regular updates about what you're working on. So yeah, with that being said, I'd love to kind of kick things off. You mentioned on a previous call that we were both on, you talked about the phases of remote work adaptation. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion on that. And I think it's really an interesting point worth unpacking. So do you mind walking me through that and we can chat about it?
Absolutely. So I'm screen sharing here. So this is the article that I wrote. I put this up in GitLab's all remote handbook. You can access this by going to allremote.info, and it's one of the guides that are listed. But this was an interesting concept. It actually was spun up by Sid and Todd, our CMO and CEO. And at the time, we were just discussing kind of two phases of remote. And then I started kind of unpacking it and ended up writing down 4 of them. And I actually think there may be more than 4, but because our handbook is always evolving, I may actually add more to this as we discover it. But I'll start here with phase 1. I'll kind of go over the 4 phases as I see them and how we implement them and live them at GitLab. And if you have any questions or want to interrupt, let me know. So I'll just briefly go over these and then I'll stop the screen share. Phase 1 is skeuomorphism. At a high level, this is essentially scrambling to press copy on what you were doing in the office and pasting it virtually. So you're seeing a lot of suddenly remote companies kind of try to figure out phase 1, which is, can we just have business continuity? Can we replicate what we were doing in the office in a virtual way? I want to bring up the whiteboarding fixation in that as I dig deeper as well. Phase 2 is functional, and it starts with a fundamental question of, what if we didn't do things the way we've always done them? And so this is a majorly powerful question to ask as a remote team, because it insinuates that you've moved beyond stabilization and now you're giving yourself enough time to pause and say, wait a minute, we're in a fundamentally different work environment. What if there's opportunity here? What if we should do something different? Phase 3 is implementing asynchronous ways of working. So this would be defaulting to trying to get something done through an asynchronous, more inclusive way to communicate, instead of always defaulting to how many people can we get in a synchronous meeting to hash something out. And then phase 4 is intentionality. And we go in depth on this, but the biggest intentional thing I can think of is a company, and I actually know of a company that's doing this. They had 2 offices. They moved all 200 of their companies remote due to COVID-19, and they're fully shutting one office down. So when it's all said and done, they're going to end up with about 80 seats in office 1, and then they have 120 people that no longer have a desk. So they are being intentional. They have no choice but to get remote right, because there's nowhere for their employees to go back to when this is all said and done. I'll touch on phase 1. The thing I see very, very often is, for suddenly remote companies, they just try to take a previously scheduled boardroom meeting, invite the exact same people, keep the same time and everything, but just make it a Zoom meeting. But they don't do anything about the meeting differently. It's passable, but it's not ideal. So how you would evolve this, I want to take this instance all the way to phase 4. Phase 2 of this would be like, okay, wait a minute. We had this meeting scheduled, but is there an opportunity to do something differently? Maybe, since we're already using Microsoft Teams or Google Docs, we could just use a tool that we're already using in a more sophisticated way. So how about for our virtual meetings, we append a Google Doc agenda to each calendar invite, and that way we improve our meeting hygiene. So when we have the Zoom call, people could already add their input ahead of the meeting, and because the names are listed out, no one speaks on top of each other because we just follow the doc. And as people ask things and then things are answered, someone else on the call documents, and at the end of the call, you have this nice package takeaway that even if people weren't in the meeting, they now have this document. Phase 3 of that would be moving more asynchronous, which is establish the meeting, so far in advance that you actually could share that agenda doc around with the team. And even if people can't be on the call, but they had a question, they could write it down a day or even an hour in advance, have someone else on the call verbalize it and document the takeaway. And they don't even have to be in the meeting to take part in the meeting and contribute to the meeting. That would be phase 3. Phase 4 is fully intentional, where you would say, we're going to implement a tool or a process where we don't even have to have meetings. We are actually deliberately implementing a workflow that removes the need for almost all meetings. So at GitLab, we do all of our work in a GitLab issue or merge request. And this is how we avoid a lot of meetings, because instead of laying out an idea in a meeting, we will lay an idea out in a GitLab issue, in a public issue. We'll share it around with the team. Anyone in the company can add feedback or comments or whatever. And you have this nice threaded, documented, low context, high precision piece of information where you plugged all knowledge leaks. Because in meetings, knowledge just leaks out of every pore. No one documents anything. It's in one ear, out the other. You're trying to focus on like, what time is it? It's meetings are a disaster. So now we're being intentional about focusing on the result that we wanted to get out of the meeting, not the medium, which is the meeting. And this goes back to the whiteboarding fixation, where I oftentimes hear, how do you replicate whiteboarding in a virtual setting? And my response is, don't try to do that. You're focusing on the medium. Stop trying to replicate the whiteboard. Focus on what you got out of the whiteboarding session. Did you whiteboard for the sake of whiteboarding? Highly unlikely. You wanted a result. So is there any set of tools or processes that you can put in place to get to the result and stop focusing on the medium? So how's that, phase 1 through 4? Any questions on that?
That's super awesome. A few kind of thoughts as I kind of am thinking about it. One thing I talk about a bit is like when you're in the office, at least this is my view, 80% of your communication is done synchronously and call it 20% is done asynchronously. And remote, from my perspective, based on my kind of past, if you can get to the exact opposite, that is a really, really great outcome. And so like, as I think about the phases of adaptation, it's almost like, well, first of all, it's an exercise in behavior change at scale, depending on how big your company is. But B, it seems like what you're doing is you're really shifting the burden of communication more and more to written or asynchronous communication because of all the reasons you mentioned. Meetings are expensive. It's difficult to coordinate a bunch of people in one room. It also, the way I think about it is every real-time conversation you have creates a potential bottleneck. And so if you can do most of it asynchronously, then you remove a lot of the bottlenecks. And so for us internally, I have one regular meeting a week. And it's because, it's taken work, but we've created processes to the way that we communicate and share updates so that people still feel aware of what's going on, even, when they're in a different time zone. So I really like that. And I think that's like a super interesting way of breaking it down because, this doesn't happen overnight. Like behavior change does not happen in 3 days. And so I really like how you think about that. And especially as it pertains to really, a lot of people are still stuck in phase 1. We can discuss this more later. But it seems like this, COVID-19 is really forcing people to think, and it feels like they're on level 1, they're thinking about going to level 2. We'll discuss that more later towards the end. But yeah, that's a wonderful kind of way of thinking about, a company adapts. I've seen that happen firsthand. The best places I've worked kind of figured that out. And the places that didn't make remote work work that well, we're still stuck on like phase 1, really.
And the reason I think it's important to break it down into phases is also so that it's just not super overwhelming. For a suddenly remote company, a lot of them are trying to go from 0 to mastery, 0 to phase 4 in the course of a day or a week. And it's simply not possible. Mm-hmm. So it's an impossible burden. And so my recommendation has been, don't worry about that. Get yourself stabilized in phase 1 and then figure out the sustainable, healthy approach to getting to phase 2 and then celebrate that and then iterate a little bit more, get comfortable with that and then go to phase 3, celebrate that. And before you know it, 3-6 months down the road, you'll be well along the path to getting to phase 4. So don't expect it to just happen overnight. Focus on getting each phase right. The other thing you noted of shifting the burden to documentation, I think this is a hugely important takeaway. Like if you remember nothing else about how do I get remote right, in every element of your business, ask yourself this question: how can I shift this from a human burden to a burden of documentation? This has been very important in conversations I've had on how do you onboard people remotely. Sometimes we'll have 30 or 40 people join GitLab in a week. If we had to have a human walk beside them every step of the way so they learn through osmosis and shadowing, we would need 30 to 40 individuals to one-on-one with them. It's impossible to scale. And again, tons of knowledge leaks would happen in that. So we shift all that we can into documentation. Everyone gets a GitLab issue. There's 200 checkboxes, maybe more by now, of what to read, in what week, on what day. And then we pair that with an onboarding buddy, someone that's in the company that can serve as their mentor to help guide them and connect the dots if the documentation fails in any way. But in general, just shifting burdens from humans to documentation, it lets you know that you're on the right path. I think the more that you shift to documentation, the further along the remote phase adaptation you'll go.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I think maybe this is a good segue into unpacking GitLab's handbook and how that process works. But a few quick notes. What I kind of see out in the market is what I think makes you all so unique is clearly the magnitude in which your company is operating at, 1,000+ people, but also the way that kind of how I think about it is, a lot of people are using wikis right now. You are using source control to manage your documentation. And I've done a bit of research on kind of the problems with a wiki. And I kind of break it down into 3 buckets. One, there's clearly the angle of it can become stale over time. The second is some people participate more than others, at least generally speaking, right? I call it kind of a tax on the most productive people in a company, because if you're asked the same question 6 times, at some point, you're just going to write it down. And then the third thing is it can be kind of cluttered and need almost like a librarian of sorts. And so what I'm very curious to unpack is how you maybe go about solving those problems in a context of using, source control really at its core to manage the flow of how your handbook functions and adapts over time.
Yes, one of my favorite topics. So I'm sharing a screen now, which is a handbook section on handbook-first documentation. And we're careful to not just blindly recommend documentation, because documentation without structure is just chaos. So we say you need to implement a culture where you work handbook first. As in, if a process is going to change, you have to document the change in the handbook first and then disseminate and communicate out, not the opposite, which is catastrophically different than most people are used to. So I've actually spun up this section on tools for building a handbook. And one of our teammates just created this suddenly remote handbook. And it's essentially a stripped down version of GitLab that anyone in the Getting Started guide, and I'll link this in the show notes, you just create a GitLab account and essentially you just grab this code and it gets you started. So you don't have a blank page to start from. So we put this out there, we're iterating on it in typical MVC fashion. We hope to have a more polished approach down the road. A lot of people, as you mentioned, use a wiki. We don't think that wikis scale. The 2 big problems with a wiki are this. There's no source control or version control, so essentially the executives are the only one that change it. The problem with that is if you don't empower everyone to change it, then you don't empower everyone to read it or care about it. So to your point, maybe the executives are super invested in it, no one else reads it. So they create these kind of like black market, gray market channels of communication where, the handbook is over here, but this is like how things actually happen. That's what will happen if you don't empower everyone to be able to create proposals to change it. So source control, from my perspective, is essential to doing a handbook right. And the reason is it creates empowerment and autonomy in a very real way. So I'll give you an example of how this actually happened. I was an onboarding buddy with someone in the design team. couple of weeks in, I asked them how onboarding was going, and she said, going great, but I kind of missed the typical new hire orientation where I see everyone that also joined the company in a given week. We get to kind of roam around the lobby, commiserate, so on and so forth. And it dawned on me that we have a new Labbers Slack channel where everyone in a given week is announced. And I thought, well, you could just throw out your Zoom link, get everybody in the chat, like for the first hour of your day, the last hour of your day, and essentially replicate a virtual new hire orientation. She said, that sounds like an amazing idea. Thanks for asking. So I said, well, we should add that as something that the onboarding buddy asks the other person as part of the process, because you never know. Like, does somebody want this? Does somebody not? It's on the onboarding buddy to ask that question. So we worked on a merge request together to change that in the onboarding buddy responsibilities and add that as a question that the onboarding buddy has to ask the new hire. And it was merged by the people group. So 2 weeks into her tenure at GitLab, she has fundamentally changed how we do onboarding. That is incredibly empowering. Now she's fully invested in the handbook. She's going to be looking at the handbook every day. She's going to consult the handbook as the single source of truth. If she sees something that's out of date, she's going to be empowered and encouraged to change it or find the right person that can help change it. To me, this is where source control and version control is essential, and it's gonna be the litmus test between companies that just have a kind of a static handbook where only certain people are authorized to change it, and a handbook where everyone is empowered to contribute.
Mm-hmm. That's super cool. What I find kind of interesting about your approach in particular is, if I think about, let's say, the office environment, people talk about, like, this is the way we do things, right? This is kind of the company culture. And oftentimes there's not really a series of logic or there's not context to how that cultural artifact became to be. And if you use source control and you scope things with a handbook, they can look back and can see the decision-making process for why this key activity matters and the decision-making process that went into that. To me, that feels so much more transparent than how things, kind of happen when you're all together in the same room.
It's not only transparent, it's incredibly liberating, and it just makes good business sense. For example, I joined GitLab years after it was founded, but I can go to the Git history of our values page and see literally every change that ever happened, every sub-value that was added. What was the merge request? What was the context around it? When did this happen? What was going on in the world that may have spurned an idea? What was happening? What was the context? I can see that because we used source control and version control years ago. You're essentially paying it forward for people that will come after you, giving them the ability to always look back and see how something was done or something was decided on. This is really important when it comes time to change something. So for example, we had a company call for years where everyone would join at the same time every day. We would talk about promotions and bonuses and overall like large company topics, things like that. And it got to a point where it just didn't scale. We just saw the numbers of attendees dwindling, although the scale of our company was rapidly increasing. And so we had to say, like, where did this come from? Where did this idea come from? What was the impetus behind this? Because that context will help us evolve this. It will help us change this so that we don't, like, maybe we do just let it decay and die, and that's a deliberate choice. But at least if we have the context, we can see what was the atmosphere like? How many people were on this to begin with? What were we talking about? Have things changed? You mentioned this a little bit, but culture is what you document. And in a remote setting, it's so glaring. Because in a co-located space, culture can just be the aura or the vibe of the office, which is really the loudest voice in the room or the driving persona. And if this person is like out on vacation or having a bad day, or it can oscillate based on mood and socioeconomic factors. That's not culture. It's very dangerous to let your culture be defined by that. So our culture is documented. It's what we write down. It's in our values. This is how we treat each other. This is how we treat our clients. It's all written down. And if it is incompatible with how you think we should treat people going forward, then we change it in the handbook first, and then we start the actual living out of that. Mm-hmm. It would be very difficult for me to go back to a place now where there's just no context. Like, hey, welcome to the company. What happened in the 20 years prior? No one knows. Great. Like, what an awesome start. You're essentially just trying to absorb whatever's happening the week you joined, as if that's any sort of real indicator on the actual culture of the company. So if you're not documenting, start now. I get that it's overwhelming. You're like, oh, I wish I would have started that 10 years ago. But there's this old adage about planting a tree. You know, you wish you would have planted it 10 years ago, but the next best time is right now. Like, just start now, and then you'll at least have some infrastructure going forward.
That's awesome. Maybe this is related to what one of your coworkers just spun up, but if you were to think about a basic, call it schema for a handbook, let's say for either a new startup or a company that is thinking about implementing a handbook, what would you recommend the schema be? It seems like there's kind of uh, maybe like two buckets. One is just guiding principles of sorts, or these building blocks, and then you have department or functional kind of yeah, the pages. What do you recommend there for someone who is going from zero to something?
Yeah, I would start with three things in this order. Document your values first, because all of your departmental pages that come after that need to map back to that North Star. So values first. And don't just write down the 6 words. Like, GitLab has 6 core values: iteration, results, collaboration. These are words you've heard before. But we have thousands of words underneath of them, these sub-values that substantiate how do you live this value. You have to be very prescriptive about that. So that would be the phase one, what I would do first. The second thing I would build in the handbook is communication, a full end-to-end guide on how this company communicates. Where does work communication happen? Where does informal communication happen? How do we use Slack? How do we use Zoom? How do we communicate externally? You have to be very prescriptive about this, very intentional about this. GitLab expires our Slack messages after 90 days deliberately so that no work or ideation happens in Slack, because Slack is a recipe for disaster trying to get projects done. All information is siloed. Some things are in direct messages. Some things are in private rooms. Some things are in public rooms. Nightmare. So we write that down in the communication section of our handbook. Do not do work. Do not communicate about work in Slack, because it will vanish after 90 days. Communicate about work in this tool called GitLab. For every company, it's going to be different, but be prescriptive about it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is each department should spin up their own section of the handbook. So we have a corporate marketing section, we have an overall marketing section, a strategic marketing section, engineering, HR, finance, so on and so forth. So each section would have their individual code owners, as we call them. So of course the CFO would approve anything that would go into the finance section, etc. The reason why you want the communication and the values done first is because as your department leads build out their sections of the handbook, you want all of them looking back at the same North Star as they document their processes and protocols. So that at the end of it, when it's done, and by the way, it's never done, it's always evolving, it's always iterating, you can look across each department and say, hey, I get it. These processes were based on the same values as every other part of the company. That's a really good place to be. And if you don't do that first in that order, everyone kind of has their own guiding principles, largely driven by whatever their past experience has been in a prior organization.
Got it. Got it. That's super helpful. Cool. The third kind of topic of discussion I'd like to cover is I've heard this quite a bit, especially with everybody cooped up at home. But it's the idea of social interaction, and then also the future. What the next year or so looks like. I guess I'll kind of quickly outline where I'm at. The first thing I always say is, well, these are clearly not. This is not your average remote work experience.
That's right.
And the second is that, people talk about social interaction and they say something like, well, I'm extroverted and I really like to be around people, which I'm extroverted and I really like being around people as well. And how I would respond is just essentially saying, hey, my social interaction doesn't have to happen with my coworkers necessarily. And I think that for me, that's a huge point of difference, because I still go out and in a non-COVID world, I'll have coffee with people in the community, or I'll try to hang out with my neighbors a little bit more than I did before. How do you think about that? And maybe what in a normal remote work scenario, what does maybe like your personal breakdown look like between, you know, GitLab coworkers as well as outside of GitLab?
It's a super important point, and I'm really glad you phrased it that way. I see it happening in two buckets. First of all, on a remote team, you do have to be much more intentional about ensuring that you create an atmosphere for colleagues to bond as a team. Great example is our people group will meet with our individual department leads and brainstorm ways that they can create that. So our marketing team a few weeks ago actually had an all marketing talent show. And this was very simple to create. Our people group put a calendar invite on the entire marketing department with an agenda doc that says, sign up here if you have a talent. We arranged for a few judges. We arranged for a few prizes so everyone knows you could sign up. You can show off your talent on a Zoom cam. You'll be judged. Prizes will be sent out. So we had 135, I think, people on a Zoom call. And we had all kinds of crazy stuff happening. We had someone doing sign language with their dog. We had someone zooming into their kitchen and like cooking fajitas, flames going everywhere. It was crazy. And it's something that you couldn't actually do in an office. And so I think that opportunities like that enable you to build even more authentic and genuine bonds with people in a remote setting. You just have to try. You have to think, okay, we all have Zoom cams. We don't have the burden of the office. What is the opportunity here? Same thing in Slack. We create topical channels. We have a great parenting channel where parents across the world who are now pulling double duty as homeschool teachers can communicate about resources that they found, assets that they found, websites that they found, tutorials that they found. It's a great place to just share that, commiserate, and just share honest war stories of like, hey, does anyone else's house look like a complete mess? Any tips on convincing kids to actually help me clean up? I mean, these are the conversations that we have as colleagues, which I think is really powerful. So that's one element of it. Be intentional. Don't just expect spontaneity and fate to take care of people talking to each other like you would see in the office, because it's never going to happen. But the second part of it is more interesting. And you touched on this. I've heard people say, how do you replicate, let's go get drinks or dinner after work? Let's go spend a few hours after work hanging out together so I can fill my social quota. My response to that is, should you really be filling that social quota with people at work? And this can cause some like interesting reactions, because some people are so involved in work and their identity is so tightly tied to their vocation that it's almost a slight to suggest they should fill that quota from anything else. But the way I see it is this is a chance to pause and ask yourself, is that even healthy? Or are you spending an unhealthy amount of time fully invested in work before and after the clock, so to speak? So for me, I would say, look at other avenues to fill your social quota. Are you spending enough time with your family, with your children, with your spouse, with your significant other? Are you calling your parents or cousins or aunt and uncles enough? Are you invested in your community? Do you even know your neighbors? When's the last time you said anything to them? Are there any community projects going on that you have some spare cycles that you could lend a hand, whether it's Habitat for Humanity or just like a local car wash, anything? There's so much going on, and we've become so honed in on connecting our own identities to work that now that's the thing we're grappling with. How do I replace that? And my answer is somewhat uncomfortable with, maybe you should replace it with something outside of work. So to more personally answer your question, I actually try to disconnect with work as fast as I can. I try to be really efficient and effective with work so that it enables more time for life. And that's one of the benefits of the GitLab culture. We try to create a work atmosphere where people can get things done very efficiently so they can disconnect as quickly as possible. We try to measure results and not focus on how many hours you spend here, because honestly, it's better if you spend more hours invested in things outside of work that you love, because that helps you recharge and give back more to the business. It just makes sense. So I'm very interested to see if this is something that's going to be localized or if this is going to spread a bit further. But I think it's an interesting time, like almost an awakening, this great pause moment where people are finally asking themselves that question: how tightly should my identity be tied to work? And should I fill my social quota somewhere else?
That's a really, really good point. One thing I've been kind of kicking around in my mind is I kind of think about like how more and more communication happens online. remote or work in the office in many capacities is like the last holdout for actual in-person interaction. And so like for that last shoe or that last thing to drop, it's almost like at that point you actually have to think about all the things that you're doing these days that are online, when in reality it's like you don't know your neighbor across the street.
Yes.
So it's really interesting that you mentioned that. It's something, there's some huge implications here. And maybe, yeah, to maybe wrap the call up, let's talk about maybe what the next 6 months and 1 year unfolds for, remote work. Before we started recording, we were talking about how, it feels like it's accelerated significantly. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about the future, and I have some pretty bold predictions, and I hope some of them come true. I think in 6 months, what you're going to see is you're going to have tens of millions of people kind of collectively look at each other with the realization that the myth of your job can't be done from anywhere is now broken. And we all know it. The managers know it, the leaders know it, the executives know it, Wall Street knows it, everyone knows it. There's no putting this genie back in the bottle. So I think it's going to massively democratize this whole notion. It's going to massively empower workers to essentially go back to leadership and say, look, even in the most suboptimal of situations, we just accomplished our work in our homes for the last 3 to 4 months. We slept better, we exercised more, we saw our families more, we were more efficient and effective with our time at work, we spent less money on gas, we commuted less. How about we don't go back to the office as the default? We just have the office there, kind of a special occasion, where I think this is going to flip the notion of home is now the default, the office is the exception, whereas pre-COVID, it was exactly the opposite. You almost needed a special excuse to work from home. Now I think you're going to need a special excuse to go into the office, like justify the time you're going to spend commuting, because that could be time better spent either working or doing something outside of work. That mental shift is going to be huge. Maybe a year down the road, I think the second order of this is when you have the people already in that mindset. Silicon Valley is a great example. Then their lease comes up for renewal. They're going to look down and say, I'm spending how much money to live in this shoebox? This isn't even the most ideal place to work. So how about I think about going somewhere small, mid-sized town community where I can actually invest in the community, see tangible difference in the community, better schools for my children, better air quality, more space, maybe even move back to your hometown, a place that meant something to you, but you felt like you had to leave because of vocation. I think this becomes the start of reversing the great rural depopulation that we've seen, kind of the brain drain of small towns, small cultures into the major urban centers, because that's where the work was. Maybe we start to see that kind of rewinding and going back. And I actually think this is going to let cities breathe a bit more. You've even seen this in COVID, where air quality in some towns in China and water quality in Venice, it's unbelievable. Like it's better than it's been in years and years and years, just because people have paused for a second. So I think even the major urban centers would benefit from this. There's less infrastructure strain on their subway systems and public services and things like that. My hope is that that starts to happen, coupled with people having an introspective look on how tightly should my vocation and identity be tied together. I think it's a great moment for us to pause and remember that we're humans first and colleagues second. And I think this is going to drag out long enough that it won't soon be forgotten. I think if this happened and it was over and solved really, really quickly, we're humans. We always are on to the next thing. But I think this one's going to linger for a bit. And I hope it does, because it'll serve as a reminder that it's a tragedy to get where we have gotten, but this is our chance to rally around ourselves and our communities as humanity. So I'm optimistic about it. I don't know if all of that will come true right away, but I think we're going to start to see that happening. As I've talked to a lot of educators, a lot of researchers, and even a lot of big business leaders are already saying, we're going to permanently shift some of our employees to remote. And once you've built that great remote infrastructure, geography and work get decoupled. It's just basically down to your imagination where you take it from there.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I think I read I think it was a Gardner report. I think it said something along the lines of 75% of CFOs are looking at shifting 5% of their workforce or more remote.
Correct.
Which, like, the way I think about this shift is there's a few things from my perspective at play. The first is, remote work has been a topic of interest for a while and it's been growing. But in many ways, I don't want to call it a nice to have, but it was something that people with leverage could do, right?
Right.
Where if you were a super solid engineer, you could say, I'm going to work from where I want. And it seems like with the current economic climate, it's almost, it feels more like it's shifting to become a bit more of a must have due to cost pressure in particular. So that's one thing I've been following pretty closely. The second thing that I find interesting as well is I think there'll be maybe a little bit more polarization. You'll still have those holdouts where they're like, hey, the office is the best. Just think of how unproductive you were, kind of ignoring the fact that, you know, your kid is home too. But I've seen a few, it was a bit more anecdotal kind of Twitter polling, but it seems like it's breaking down where you have something like 60% of people are thinking about remote in a deeper capacity. That could be fully distributed or a bit more distributed, right? Shifting the bounds away from the office. And then you have, call it 30% of people that are still like, the office is where it's at. I'm going to go back to doing that. And so I've been kind of tracking that. And it will be interesting to see how that unfolds. The elephant in the room from my perspective is when you give people that like month and a half or so, or however long this lasts, to work remotely, they will change their behavior. It's just a matter of time. Which means moving from ideally level 1 to level 2, if you can pull it off. And then to zoom out even a little bit more, which very much falls in line with how you're thinking. I grew up in a town of 900 people in the middle of nowhere. At some point, I would like to live further out in the country because that's the experience I had growing up. It's not for
Sure.
everybody.
Yeah.
But, you know, it seems like there's something really meaningful there to create a work environment where people can do interesting work no matter where they live. And so my hope is that that continues to happen because, you know, living in the city wasn't for me. I live in a smaller city now, or outside of it. And I'd like to be able to work even a bit more remotely in the future, not have it, you know, hurt my career, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely agree. I think it's going to help everyone. Businesses realize that if you can decouple geography with business results, it de-risks your business all the way around. So now it's starting to make sense even from the business front. I think the big aha moment is going to happen when you see CEOs sit down on CNBC and they have to justify why they spent what they did in a given quarter on real estate. Once those questions start popping up in earnings calls and that becomes the hot seat, then there's really going to be nowhere to go. It's like, you know, all of these other competitors are chopping their real estate cost and empowering people to live and work from anywhere. Why isn't your company able to do that? That's going to be a big forcing function from the business standpoint. But you're right. I think it's the genie has been let out of the bottle and people are starting to understand, hey, running a business through micromanagement, command and control, and fear might have had its time, maybe, but it's not now. And you can kind of let go of the reins a little bit, put managers in place that lead more through service and feedback and understanding and smaller chunks and iterative processes, and it can work. We're all collectively as a society learning a fundamentally new way to work. We're doing it very rapidly. I think humanity deserves a round of applause for adapting as fast as we have, even in a suboptimal situation. I'm encouraged for the future, man. And this conversation has been amazing. I think we should do a round 2.
Yeah, totally.
And for anyone listening, I'm going to be sure to put relevant links for myself and for Luke down in the show notes so you can click around and share the documentation far and wide. So until next time, Luke, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Darren. See ya.